The whistle cut through the fog like a blade. A train full of soldiers had left Berlin that morning. They were young, barely out of their teens. Some carried letters pressed tight to their chests. Others clutched photographs, small tokens of home. Their eyes betrayed the war they had not yet seen. They marched onto carriages. The last thing they ever saw was the station platform disappearing behind them. And then nothing. No reports. No crash. No trace. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the train whole. Welcome to Uncommon Stories. If this story stays with you, hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and when the truth found you. Now let's begin. The year was 1943. Europe was burning. Every village, every forest, every rail line carried the echoes of fear. And yet, this train, an olive green military transport, was ordinary, simple, unremarkable, except that it carried more than metal and wheels. It carried 120 soldiers, their lives stretched tight between hope and terror. The station master remembered them. They looked like boys, he said, decades later. They tried to laugh, but the laughter didn't reach their eyes. You could see it. The war had already begun in them. The train rolled out of the station. The fog swallowed its sound. And then, near a remote stretch of forest outside Gleesmerode, it vanished. No derailment. No enemy attack. Nothing. Families received letters marked missing convoy. And the world moved on. Yet whispers persisted. Some said the train had been sabotaged. Others believed it collided with something the army tried to hide. Diaries hinted at strange sightings. Soldiers wandering forests lost, whispering about tunnels that weren't on any map. But the decades turned those whispers into legend. The forest grew thick. The rails disappeared beneath roots and moss. Locals avoided the tracks. Stories of ghost trains and vanishing soldiers became bedtime tales, whispered to children with wide eyes. But history doesn't forget. 77 years later, a team of archaeologists arrived, equipped with ground-penetrating radar, equipped with the patience of those who know that some truths refuse to stay buried. And the earth it remembered, a rectangular anomaly appeared beneath the soil, precise, deliberate, where maps suggested the train should have been. The team approached. Every step was careful, reverent, because this was not just metal and timber. This was a story paused for nearly 8 decades. Inside the forest, families listened to the news with trembling hands. Elderly men shivered at the memory of wartime mornings. And the ground waited, silent, patient. The first shovelfuls revealed rail partially intact. Carriages, faintly visible under centuries of soil. Buttons, belt buckles, small personal items. Ordinary objects, extraordinary now. Each scrape of the trowel brought life back to men who had vanished in an instant. Boys who never returned home. Sons who would never see their mothers again. Letters that were never delivered. Photographs long faded. The forest seemed to lean closer. A crow cawed. Leaves whispered. Time itself held its breath. 77 years of silence, of grief, of unanswered questions were ending. And one question hovered above them all. What truly happened when the train disappeared into the mist? The answer would not be simple, but it was waiting, because the vanished train had returned, and the soldier's story was about to be heard. The forest around Gleesmerode had always been dense. Even in the 1940s, the trees were tall, their roots tangled and blackened with centuries of storms. Soldiers who passed near it spoke of it in hushed tones. Some claimed the woods were alive, not with animals, but with something else, something patient, something that watched. The 120 men aboard that train had names, faces, lives, stories that ended abruptly, yet left echoes that lingered to this day. Heinrich Müller was one of them, a boy from Leipzig, barely 17, when the war pulled him from school benches and into the army. He had letters tucked in his jacket, meant for his mother, describing the color of the Seine, the smell of bread baking in France. He wrote of small joys, of tiny freedoms, of the hope that he could survive the madness. Friedrich Bauer was 20, a farmer's son from Bavaria. He carried a photograph of his younger sister. In his letters, he joked about the absurdity of war. Trying to shield himself from fear, he refused to voice aloud. And there was Karl Richter, the oldest on the train, 24, a young man hardened by early battles, carrying guilt for surviving skirmishes that had claimed his friends. He kept a small wooden carving of a horse from home, a gift from his father, clasped tightly to his chest. They were not heroes in the grand sense. They were ordinary young men, boys pressed into extraordinary circumstances. Yet in their ordinariness, there's a poignancy that endures. The train itself was a labyrinth of cold steel. Olive green carriages, long and unremarkable, lined with wooden benches and storage compartments. Soldiers joked nervously. Some stared silently at the floorboards. Others wrote letters or whispered last thoughts to the men beside them. Each footstep on the metal floor echoed louder than they realized, like a drumbeat counting down the moments before the world would change forever. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Schreiber, was meticulous. His eyes were sharp, his uniform pressed, every order crisp, yet even he could not see what was coming. He could not anticipate the fog, the silence, the interruption that would erase the train from history. Outside, Europe was a continent on fire. Cities were reduced to rubble. Forests burned in the distance. Smoke climbed to the heavens like a morning veil. And in that chaos, a single train moved quietly, carrying young lives into the unknown. Families watched the departure with hope and dread intertwined. Mothers pressed hands to mouths, whispering prayers that would go unanswered. Fathers stood stiff, trying to hide fear behind stoicism. Siblings waved, their small hands trembling as they saw their brothers disappear behind the train doors. The train rolled through towns that had learned to live with war's uncertainty. Smoke hung over rooftops. Shops were shuttered. Soldiers patrolled streets, eyes wary, weapons ready. And yet, the train's passage seemed almost routine, a necessary movement in a world that had lost all sense of normalcy. Inside the carriages, life went on in microcosm. Men traded stories of home. One spoke of a summer spent fishing with his father. Another remembered the scent of roses in his mother's garden. They clung to these memories like life buoys, because none knew what the next mile would bring. Even as the train entered the fog near Gliesmerode, laughter and conversation filled the carriages. But there was tension, subtle and unspoken. Eyes darted to the windows. Some noticed the stillness of the trees, the way the fog seemed thicker here than anywhere else. The men whispered about shadows that moved unnaturally, about sounds that weren't quite right. Lieutenant Schreiber attempted to reassure them. "Just fog," he said. "Nothing more." But even his voice carried a tremor, a hint of doubt, and then the train slowed. No one could explain why. The engine whined. Wheels screeched. Something deep in the forest seemed to press down on the rails. The soldiers leaned forward, straining to see through the mist. Shapes emerged. Or did they? Shadows? Figures? The mind plays tricks when fear is near. Moments passed, and then the train was gone. No wreckage, no sign of struggle, just silence. For the families, the news was devastating. Letters from the army arrived weeks later. They were formal, cold, missing in transit, status unknown. Words that erased certainty, words that shattered hope. In towns along the line, rumors spread. Some claimed the train had been sabotaged by enemy operatives. Others whispered of secret missions gone wrong. Children who had waved goodbye told their parents they had seen ghostly lights in the forest. Old men muttered about war spirits, of trains that disappear when no one is watching. Historians decades later examined records. Nothing matched. No attack. No derailment. No report of missing trains in official archives. It was as if the soldiers had vanished from existence entirely. Yet traces remained. Diaries found in abandoned houses spoke of hearing trains in the distance that were never there. Villagers recalled seeing smoke rising to the fog, only to find nothing but trees. And in the darkness of memory, the forest waited, patient, silent. For decades, attempts to uncover the truth failed. Amateur historians scoured maps. Satellite images were studied. Searches were launched. Each time, the result was the same: emptiness. The train had vanished, its soldiers lost, its story frozen in time. But 77 years later, the forest yielded a clue. Archaeologists equipped with modern tools discovered a rectangular anomaly beneath the soil. Not random, not natural, something deliberate, something man-made. The first hint that the vanished train was not just a legend. The team approached cautiously. They knew this was more than an excavation. It was a resurrection of history. Every turn of the spade, every scrape of the trowel, was a step closer to answers decades in the making. They began to uncover metal, rusted but intact. Wheels, rails, carriages pressed together like relics in a tomb. And within them, artifact that belonged to the soldiers themselves. A belt buckle here, a button there, fragments of letters, charred and brittle. Each piece told a story. A boy who loved music, a young man who had been promised a farm, a soldier who had never seen the sea. Their lives, long paused, were beginning to speak again. The forest held its breath. The wind whispered through the trees. Time itself seemed to lean in, eager to witness history returning. And beneath it all, the unanswered question remained. What had truly happened to the train and to the soldiers aboard it in that final fog-bound moment? For the first time in 77 years, the world was close enough to hear the answer, and the truth was buried, waiting to be revealed. The morning fog was thick that day, a heavy, damp blanket that clung to the forest floor, the kind of fog that swallowed sounds, the kind that made the world feel unreal. The train rolled forward, the wheels clattering softly against the rails. Inside, the soldiers were uneasy. Small whispers passed from one carriage to the next. Some joked to hide fear. Some stared silently out the windows. The mist blurred the trees into shadowy shapes, tall and silent, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Lieutenant Schreiber paced the aisle. His polished boots clicked against the wooden floorboards. He checked the men's equipment, reassured them, tried to project calm. He didn't feel, and yet even he noticed the fog growing heavier, a strange stillness pressing from the trees. It was a silence unlike any other. No birds, no wind, no distant chatter from other trains or villages. Just the train and the mist and the forest. The engine slowed. An unusual sound, metallic, groaning against the rails. Men exchanged worried glances. Something wasn't right. Heinrich Muller leaned forward, peering through the fog. "Lieutenant, do you see that?" Schreiber squinted. Shapes moved in the distance. Or were they illusions? The fog twisted and shifted, hiding the forest's edge, then revealing it again. The soldiers whispered to each other. Shadows danced where there should have been none. Then the train shuddered. Wheels screeched. The engine groaned, deep and unearthly. The men grabbed the benches and straps, bracing themselves. The noise wasn't mechanical. It was something heavier. Something unseen pressing against the rails. Carl Richter, the oldest among them, pressed a hand to the window. His breath fogged the glass. Outside, shapes loomed, towering shadows that the mind struggled to identify. Trees? Rocks? Or something else? He shook his head. He could not tell. Inside the carriages, panic began to spread. Some men whispered prayers. Others cursed softly, their voices trembling. The letters in their pockets felt heavier. The photographs in their hands seemed fragile, insignificant against whatever force had settled over the train. Then the unexpected happened. The train slowed further. Too far. The engine whined. Steam hissed into the mist. And the sound had changed. The rhythm of the wheels became irregular, stuttering, skipping. The rails beneath them groaned in protest. Men exchanged terrified glances. Lieutenant Schreiber's voice was sharp, commanding. Hold fast. Keep your positions. But even he could not hide the tremor in his tone. Outside, the forest seemed to shift. Shadows elongated. The fog twisted unnaturally, wrapping around the train like fingers. The trees leaned closer, their branches clawing at the carriages. A low, unearthly hum vibrated in the air. Something ancient, something patient. The soldiers clutched their belongings. Some pressed themselves against the walls, trying to disappear, trying to escape the growing dread. Others prayed quietly, hoping that someone, somewhere, might see them. And then the train vanished. Not derailed, not exploded, not derailed into the soil. Just gone. The sound of the engine, the clatter of wheels, the creaking of carriages, all disappeared into the fog. The trees stood silent, untouched. The mist rolled on, indifferent. In Berlin, letters were delayed. Families waited for updates. Weeks passed. The army sent notifications. Train missing in transit. Status unknown. And just like that, the men were gone. No witnesses. No evidence. Nothing to explain the sudden disappearance. But the forest remembered. Decades later, villagers recalled strange things. Lights moving through fog. Sounds in the trees that shouldn't exist. The distant echo of a train whistle when no train had ever passed. Children spoke of shadows that seemed to watch them from the woods. The adults dismissed them as stories. Folklore. War madness. Yet the truth lay beneath. Waiting. Patient. Those who had studied maps tried to trace the train's route. Lines led to the forest. But the tracks, long abandoned, had been overtaken by nature. Satellite imagery revealed anomalies, but no one could confirm anything. The train was a ghost. The soldiers were ghosts. Heinrich Müller never saw the sunlight again. Friedrich Bauer's photograph remained in a desk drawer, gathering dust. Karl Richter's wooden horse was lost in the chaos. Families waited. Friends mourned. Communities adjusted. But the question never left anyone's mind. What had happened in that forest that day? Some historians proposed sabotage, enemy interference, miscommunication. Others whispered of experiments, secret operations erased from official history. But none of it explained the vanishing. And then came 77 years of silence, until the archaeologists arrived. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies beneath the soil, shapes that mirrored the train's design, disturbances in the earth, rectangular, precise. Carriages pressed together beneath decades of soil. The team approached cautiously, each step measured. They unearthed artifacts carefully. Belt buckles, buttons, charred fragments of letters. Small objects ordinary in their time, extraordinary now. Every discovery was a piece of a story frozen in history. The forest seemed to listen. A crow called from above. Leaves whispered in the wind. Time itself seemed suspended, the past reaching forward. The vanished train had returned, and for the first time, the world could begin to understand what happened in the fog. But even as the first rail and carriage were revealed, the mystery deepened. What had swallowed the soldiers? Why had no trace remained for nearly 8 decades? The answer would not come easy, because the train had been gone, but the story, the fear, the silence, they had never left. The news traveled slowly at first. A missing convoy, a train swallowed by fog, 120 soldiers unaccounted for. Families clutched each other. Mothers wept in quiet corners. Fathers stared at walls, silent and uncomprehending. Children waited, hoping for footsteps that would never echo on the threshold. But communities refused to surrender to despair. Searches began. Soldiers were dispatched to trace the route. Scouts combed the forest near Gliesmerode. Villagers were enlisted. Lanterns pierced the mist. Horses carried riders along tracks that disappeared beneath roots. Every tree, every boulder, every curve in the rails was examined. Yet the train was gone, and with it, hope grew fragile. Still, people tried. They called the boys' names into the fog. They shouted into empty fields. Letters were sent to military offices. Reports were filed. Each day, the search expanded, spanning miles of forest and rail line. Maps were consulted. Records cross-checked. Every possible route was retraced. The local villagers spoke in hushed tones about the forest. They claimed they heard strange noises at night. A train whistle when no rails existed. Flickering lights through the trees. Shadows that moved between the trunks. Some whispered that the soldiers were alive, trapped, wandering in a place unseen by the rest of the world. Others said it was the forest itself, keeping them. Soldiers assigned to search parties returned with nothing but fatigue and unease. They spoke of fog that seemed unnatural, of silence that pressed on their ears. One scout claimed he saw the train, far off, motionless, through a break in the mist. But when he approached, there was only forest, only empty rails. The press, cautious at first, began to report on the mystery. Small articles appeared in newspapers, recounting the missing train. Families hoped. Communities watched. Yet, official statements remained vague. Investigations ongoing, they said. No confirmed sightings. Weeks turned to months, months to years. The forest reclaimed its territory. Tracks were swallowed by moss. Trees grew thicker. The stories became legend. Children told them at night. Adults avoided the woods. Still, the families held on. Heinrich Muller's mother placed candles at her window every evening. She whispered prayers into the dark, imagining her son walking toward her, uniform dirty, eyes wide but alive. Friedrich Bauer's sister kept his photograph on the mantel. She spoke to it daily, hoping her brother would hear her, wherever he was. Letters arrived from the military sporadically. They offered no answers. Words like missing and unaccounted for were repeated, hollow and cold. The men became ghosts in the bureaucracy. Their lives erased from official maps, but never from memory. Search parties returned again in the spring of 1944. New eyes, fresh energy. Forests were combed with trained dogs. Fields probed for signs of disturbance. Nothing, only the forest answering with silence. Whispers spread of strange happenings near the line of disappearance. Farmers spoke of lights moving through the trees at night. Children saw shadows that vanished when approached. Villagers were reluctant to mention them, fearing ridicule or accusation of hysteria. Some of the soldiers' friends refused to accept the disappearance as permanent. They organized private searches, retracing the route by horse and on foot. They carried supplies, water, and the hope that one day they would see their comrades again. But time was relentless. Supplies ran out. Energy waned. Hope faltered. And yet, even decades later, families held vigil. Every anniversary of the train's departure was observed. Candles lit. Memories shared. Silence filled with the echo of what had been lost. During the war, the search was overshadowed by greater chaos. Entire cities destroyed. Rail lines disrupted. Families displaced. But the missing train remained a ghost in every conversation, a reminder of what had vanished without trace. Even after the war ended, the investigation lingered. Maps were revisited. Soldiers who had survived other campaigns were questioned. Some recalled rumors of the train appearing briefly in fog, a shadow moving through the forest. Others claimed they heard whispers in the trees at night, carrying names they recognized. Yet no physical evidence emerged. No tracks. No wreckage. No bodies. Only the questions. The vanished train became legend. In the villages near Gleesmerode, elders told children of the ghost soldiers. They spoke of a train that moved silently through fog, never stopping, never returning. They warned that the forest kept secrets that should not be disturbed. Across Germany, families carried the memory of their sons, brothers, husbands. The loss became generational. Each child grew up knowing that the men had vanished, but never truly accepting it. Birthdays passed unmarked. Letters remained undelivered. Lives were frozen in the shadow of that foggy morning. Decades later, amateur historians would retrace the train's route. They pored over maps. They compared old photographs of the rails. They listened to recordings of interviews with surviving villagers. And still they found nothing. Only whispers. Only hints. Only the forest keeping its secret. But history does not forget. Even when the search fails. Even when decades pass. Even when families die waiting for answers. The earth remembers. The train remembers. And in 2020, after 77 years, it began to speak again. Ground-penetrating radar revealed shapes beneath the soil, metal rails, rectangular forms of carriages, artifacts of soldiers preserved beneath layers of dirt, buttons, belt buckles, fragments of letters, the first physical evidence in nearly 8 decades. Archaeologists approached cautiously. Every brushstroke, every trowel scrape, uncovered a story. The boys who had vanished, the letters never sent, the uniforms forgotten. They were emerging from the earth, silent witnesses to history. Families, historians, and villagers alike felt the pull of the discovery. A century of absence, grief, and unanswered questions was finally about to meet the truth. The forest, patient and eternal, watched as the world leaned in to listen. Because after decades of searching, after years of silence, the vanished train was no longer lost, and the soldiers were finally coming home. The years passed. Decades stretched like shadows over the villages near Gleesmerode. The forest remained, silent, unchanging, patient. The tracks that had carried the soldiers vanished beneath moss and roots, as if the world itself was determined to forget. Families aged. Mothers' hair turned silver. Fathers grew stooped and silent. Children who waved goodbye as boys were now old men, haunted by the memory of a morning lost in fog. They carried the absence like a weight, pressing it into every corner of their lives. Letters were preserved, tucked in drawers, pressed in books, hidden in boxes. Yellowed photographs remained in frames. Every object a tether to a life that had been erased. Every memory a whisper that could not be silenced. Communities learned to live with the void. Villagers no longer spoke aloud of ghost trains. They did not ask questions. It was easy to believe the soldiers had vanished, to accept the absence rather than confront the unknown. The forest thickened over the tracks. Trees grew taller. Shadows lengthened. Every year, hikers and travelers felt a chill passing over the paths where the train had once rolled. Some claimed they heard wheels clattering in the mist, voices calling names that had been forgotten. But no one could confirm anything. The stories became legend, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Heinrich Muller's mother never saw her son again. She died clutching a letter she had written in secret, hoping it would reach him somehow. Friedrich Bauer's sister held his photograph until her hands trembled with age, never letting it go. And Karl Richter's wooden horse remained on a mantel, a silent witness to a life lost too soon. The world moved on. Cities rebuilt. Nations healed. Rail lines modernized. Wars ended. But the vanished train remained a ghost in the memories of those who had loved the men aboard. Historians and amateur detectives still tried to find answers. They scoured archives, studied maps, consulted survivors and villagers. Every expedition ended in frustration. Ground surveys yielded nothing. Eyewitness accounts were dismissed as unreliable. Letters faded. Memories blurred. Yet beneath it all, the earth remembered. The forest remembered. The fog, the shadows, the silence, all of it remained, waiting for the day the truth would finally surface. During this silence, myths grew. Children told stories of soldiers wandering the forest at night, looking for home. Adults whispered of a train that moved through fog, but vanished when approached. Some believed the soldiers had been trapped in another time. Others said the forest had claimed them, refusing to let them go. And still, families held vigil in their own quiet ways. Candles on windowsills, prayers whispered into the dark, songs sung softly, as if calling out to the boys who had vanished. Each anniversary of the departure was observed in silence, a mark of love and remembrance, a refusal to let them be forgotten. Time did not heal. It only deepened the longing. Villagers who were children then became elders, telling younger generations of the morning when a train and its soldiers disappeared into fog. Teachers in local schools recounted the stories as history, as legend, blending memory and myth until no one could tell the difference. Yet for some, hope never died. A few dedicated historians continued their work. They pored over old photographs, examined letters and diaries, and compared maps from before and after the war. Satellite images revealed irregularities in the forest floor. Some anomalies were dismissed as natural. Others were left unexplained. Every attempt at discovery ended the same way: frustration, silence, and a growing sense of futility. And yet, the world could not let go, because history waits, and the earth remembers. The years turned into decades. 50, 60, 70. Each year, families aged, memories dimmed, but the story of the vanished train lingered like a shadow across generations. By the early 21st century, the story of the train was largely forgotten outside of small historical circles. Tourists walked the old paths, unaware of the tragedy buried beneath centuries of earth and roots. Children played near where the rails had once run. The forest seemed ordinary, peaceful even, but beneath the soil, beneath the roots, beneath the shadows, the train waited. The soldiers waited. And when the archaeologists arrived in 2020, equipped with modern technology, the silence was broken. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the faint outline of the train, pressed into the earth as if it had been waiting all this time. Carriages long buried, preserved beneath layers of soil, buttons, belt buckles, fragments of letters, tiny relics of lives erased, but not forgotten. The team approached cautiously. Every brushstroke, every careful scrape of the trowel was performed with reverence. They were not just unearthing metal and wood. They were uncovering memory itself. For the first time in 77 years, the vanished train began to return to the world. The forest seemed to respond. Leaves rustled. A crow called from above. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and decay. Time itself seemed to lean in, eager to witness the past waking from its long slumber. Families, some long deceased, some alive to witness the excavation, felt the pull of the discovery. Letters that had never reached their destinations, photographs that had been tucked away, uniforms preserved in memory. They were coming back to life, silent but speaking in ways only the heart could hear. And yet, even as the soil was removed, questions remained. What had truly happened in that foggy forest? Why had the train disappeared without a trace? And how had the soldiers survived, or not, within the earth for so long? For 77 years, the forest had held its secret. Its silence had been absolute, its patience infinite. And now, that silence was about to be broken, because the vanished train and the lives aboard it were finally returning to the light. The soil had been brushed away slowly, methodically, revealing only small hints at first: rusted metal, fragments of wood, remnants of tracks that had long been swallowed by moss and roots. The team of archaeologists paused. Each artifact was a whisper from the past, a message pressed into silence for nearly 8 decades. And then, the first major clue appeared: a carriage corner, pressed into the earth, its outline perfectly preserved beneath centuries of soil. It was small at first, barely a glimpse, but enough to send a shiver through everyone present. The team froze. Their hands hovered over the trowels. They did not speak. Some dared not breathe. The earth had finally begun to reveal its secret. Inside the carriage, a small fragment of leather appeared. A soldier's belt, cracked with age, its buckle faintly engraved with initials: H.M., Heinrich Müller. A shiver ran down the spine of the lead archaeologist. Letters, photographs, fragments of uniforms. They had all been part of a larger story, but seeing the initials feeling the presence of the man who had vanished in 1943. It made the past impossible to ignore. The team continued carefully, uncovering buttons still attached to uniforms, metal canteens, boots pressed as though the soldiers had only stepped away for a moment. Each discovery carried weight. Each object told a story of a life interrupted, a mother who would never hold her son again, a father whose grief had been a lifelong companion, brothers who never returned home. Outside the excavation, the forest seemed to lean closer. A gust of wind rattled the trees. Birds scattered. The mist rolled in again, but this time it felt different, less menacing, more like a veil being lifted. Inside the carriage, a journal appeared, its leather cover brittle, edges blackened. The pages inside were faded, some torn, some covered in soot, but the writing remained legible. A soldier's voice, trapped in time, speaking across decades. The words were ordinary. Fear, hope, memories of home, accounts of a journey interrupted, and then a sudden, chilling passage. Something is wrong. The fog is thicker than any I've seen. Shadows move where they should not. The forest watches. If this reaches anyone, know we are in danger, and we may not leave this place alive. Silence followed. The team exchanged glances. The words on the page were more than history. They were a warning. Nearby, a metal box appeared, sealed tight, corroded with age. Inside, letters that had never been delivered, photographs, small personal items, a soldier's pocket knife, a music sheet crumpled but intact, a family photograph from a Bauer household, long thought lost. Each item was a thread connecting the past to present. Each item was proof that the soldiers had been here, had existed, had disappeared, but had not been forgotten. News spread slowly. Descendants, now elderly, traveled to the excavation. They gazed at the remnants of uniforms, boots, and letters with trembling hands. Tears flowed silently. Some laughed, unable to contain the emotion. Others simply stared, overwhelmed by the sudden weight of history made tangible. The discovery sparked new investigations. Historians studied the site. Forensic experts examined the artifacts. Ground surveys extended further, revealing additional carriages pressed together beneath layers of soil, as if the train had been deliberately buried, preserved almost like a time capsule. One of the archaeologists uncovered a fragment of a map drawn by one of the soldiers, its edges blackened, symbols marked on the paper, paths through the forest, notes in the margin. If anything happens, they must know. The team realized something extraordinary. The disappearance had not been random. There was intention behind it, planning, a purpose. The forest and soil had concealed the train, yes, but by design, not accident. Villagers, now witnesses to history returning, spoke of stories passed down. Shadows in the fog, whispers in the trees, ghostly figures at dusk. Now, they understood that those tales were not merely legend. They had been memory, encoded in fear and imagination, waiting for truth to emerge. The artifacts also revealed another chilling truth. Not all soldiers had survived. Charred fragments of uniforms, bent metal, traces of fire in one carriage. Something violent had occurred. Something hurried, leaving some lives abruptly ended while others remained trapped in silence. Letters recovered from the metal box hinted at fear, confusion, and something unexplained. One soldier wrote, "We passed a fog, and it passed us back. I did not understand. The world is wrong here. If someone finds this, do not look too closely. Do not ask questions we could not answer ourselves." The words hung in the air like smoke. The past was no longer silent. It was speaking. Every find was a revelation. A soldier's belt buckle, a torn diary, a photograph pressed into the soil. And together, they told a story that had been waiting 77 years to be told. The discovery of this first major clue changed everything. The vanished train was no longer a ghost story. It was real. The soldiers had been here, and their fate, though long obscured by time, was slowly coming into focus. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the excavation, the team paused. They were aware of the gravity of what they had unearthed. This was not archaeology in the usual sense. This was history resurrected. Lives erased were now remembered. Stories lost were now found. The forest remained still, as if acknowledging the revelation. Its secrets, once held tightly, had begun to unravel. And beneath the soil, the rest of the train waited. Carriages, artifacts, letters. Everything needed to tell the soldier's story fully. The first clue had appeared, and with it, the world leaned forward, eager to learn the truth. The excavation deepened. Days passed, but time felt suspended. Each morning, the forest greeted the team with quiet whispers of wind through leaves, a gentle reminder that history was alive, and it was watching. The soil peeled back slowly, revealing more of the train. Rusted carriages pressed together, untouched by human hands for 77 years. The shape of the train was unmistakable now, a long, silent leviathan buried beneath earth and roots. The realization struck every archaeologist with profound weight. This was not just a discovery. This was resurrection. Inside the carriages, evidence of the soldiers' lives began to emerge in startling clarity. Uniforms, pressed into benches as though the men had only just left. Helmets stacked neatly, belts buckled, boots in rows. A soldier's diary lay open, pages brittle, blackened at the edges but legible. Words written with trembling hands spoke across decades. The first skeletons were uncovered in one carriage, not disordered, not scattered by time or force. The men had been arranged as if placed with care. Their faces, frozen in the moment of death, carried expressions of fear, resignation, confusion. The preservation was uncanny. Soil had acted like a coffin, protecting what the years had sought to erase. One by one, the bodies revealed personal effects, letters clutched in hands, photographs pressed against chests, small trinkets from home, a music sheet tucked in a soldier's coat, a carved wooden horse in another's grip. Every item was a story, every object a life that had been abruptly frozen. The team moved with reverence. Every brushstroke of soil removed, every careful excavation, was treated as an act of memory. They were not merely uncovering a train. They were uncovering humanity suspended in time. Among the discoveries were traces of fire in one carriage, evidence that some had attempted to survive a sudden catastrophe, a struggle lost against forces unknown. Burn marks on the wood, blackened metal, and charred fragments of letters suggested desperation, chaos, and fear. The archaeological team paused, stunned. This was more than disappearance. This was a deliberate preservation of history under layers of earth. It was violent, tragic, and precise. Among the items found was a small, corroded tin. Inside, letters, diaries, and notes written hastily in the final moments. One letter read, "The fog came. It is no longer natural. We hear whispers in the trees. Shadows move. We are trapped. I do not know if we will leave. Remember us. Remember that we were here, that we existed." The words, centuries removed from the moment of writing, were immediate in their terror. Each syllable carried the fear of a young man who had faced death in ways no one could imagine. And yet, among the horror, there were traces of hope, personal belongings meticulously preserved, small acts of humanity amid chaos. A photograph of a mother, a letter to a sister, a hand-carved charm from home. These fragments of life anchored the story in profound human emotion. The discovery also revealed the train had not disappeared by accident. The arrangement of carriages, the preservation under soil, suggested deliberate concealment. Someone had ensured that the story would be hidden, carefully, intentionally, and perhaps forever, until the world was ready to witness it again. Historians began to piece together fragments from recovered diaries, letters, and photographs. Each object, each page became a clue. The soldiers had been transferred for a mission shrouded in secrecy. Something went wrong. The fog, unnatural, thick, unyielding, interfered. And in the chaos, they had been trapped, buried alive, preserved by soil and silence. The villagers near Gleesmerode, now witnesses to the excavation, watched in awe and horror. Elderly men who had heard whispers in the forest for decades finally understood. Children had played near these woods, unaware of the tragedy beneath their feet. Now, the ghost stories had become history. The vanishings were no longer mystery. They were truth. Media coverage followed. Descendants traveled to see the site, many for the first time. Tears fell freely. Some laughed through relief and disbelief. Others could only stare at the skeletal remains of fathers, sons, uncles. Letters once thought lost were held in hands. Read aloud, shared across generations. The forest, which had held its breath for 77 years, seemed to exhale. The soil, the trees, the fog. It had witnessed history and preserved it. Now, it allowed the truth to be seen, if only for those who were ready. Experts worked tirelessly to identify the soldiers. Dental records, personal effects, handwriting analysis. Names that had been erased from the world were now restored. Heinrich Müller, Friedrich Bauer, Karl Richter, and hundreds of others. Lives remembered at last. And yet, the more they uncovered, the more questions emerged. How had the soil preserved the body so perfectly? Who had orchestrated the burial of the train? And why had some soldiers survived longer than others, while others perished almost immediately? The train was not just a historical artifact. It was a time capsule of fear, humanity, desperation, and the mysteries of war. Every carriage, every object, every skeletal form was a piece of a puzzle that had waited nearly 8 decades to be solved. As the sun set, the forest enveloped the site in gold and shadow. Archaeologists paused. They had unearthed more than a train. They had unearthed a story of lives abruptly interrupted, of history hidden beneath layers of earth and silence. And though the excavation had revealed the train and its soldiers, the forest still whispered. Shadows moved among the trees. The wind carried faint echoes of wheels on rails. History had returned, but the memory of that vanished morning. The fear, the fog, the silence remained alive. The vanished soldiers, once erased from time, were now present. Their story, their humanity, their suffering finally acknowledged. But even as answers emerged, the magnitude of what occurred weighed heavily on everyone present. 77 years of mystery had culminated in revelation, and yet the full truth, the reason the train had vanished in the fog, remained partly obscured, a lingering shadow in the forest. The forest had yielded its secret. The train and its soldiers were found. And now, the world would confront the truth. The news spread slowly at first. Families received official confirmations of remains recovered, of soldiers identified. Then the media arrived, cameras and microphones capturing the once-hidden tragedy for a world that had almost forgotten. Descendants traveled to the site, some eager, some hesitant. The elderly who had lived with unanswered questions for decades, who had held memories like fragile candles, finally stood where the earth had concealed the truth. Some wept uncontrollably. Some laughed through tears, unable to contain relief that their fathers, brothers, and sons were no longer just names in letters or whispers in stories. The letters, photographs, and personal items recovered from the carriages were returned to families whenever possible. The weight of history pressed against everyone. A photograph of a smiling young man, frozen in 1943, now held in the hands of a great-grandson. A letter never mailed, folded and preserved in the soil, finally read aloud, its words echoing across generations. Communities near Gleesmerode gathered. Small museums were arranged to display fragments of the train and artifacts. Villagers told stories of the fog, the shadows, and the whispers in the forest, now confirming decades-old tales that had once seemed like legend. The forest itself, patient and eternal, seemed to watch silently as the truth settled into the world. Historians worked to contextualize the discovery. Archives were revisited. Military reports from the war were scrutinized. Every piece of evidence was cross-referenced, and the more they learned, the more the complexity of the tragedy emerged. The soldiers had vanished not through negligence or error alone. There were signs of deliberate concealment, evidence of confusion, fear, and perhaps attempts to protect the world from witnessing something that had gone terribly wrong. The discovery reignited questions. How could a train, full of men, vanish without a trace for so long? Why had some soldiers survived longer than others, only to succumb to forces unknown? Who, if anyone, had orchestrated the concealment of the train? And most importantly, how could the world reconcile decades of absence with the sudden, undeniable presence of truth? Families confronted feelings long buried. Relief intertwined with grief. Anger mingled with sorrow. For generations, the soldiers had existed only in memory, in stories whispered over dinner tables, in letters never mailed. Now they were tangible, flesh and bone preserved by time. Objects returned from the soil. Lives interrupted, now remembered. Descendants read the diaries aloud. One fragment, written hastily by a soldier named Friedrich Bauer, spoke of fear in the fog, shadows moving in a forest that seemed alive. We are trapped. We do not know how long we can last. I fear the trees watch us. Remember us. If anyone survives, tell our families we love them. Tears fell as voices echoed the words, the weight of history pressing upon those listening. Every line, every letter became a conduit to the past, to the moment when lives had been lost, frozen in time by the earth itself. For the archaeologists, the excavation became more than science. Each artifact, each skeleton, each personal item was a story restored. The work was solemn, careful, deliberate. They were not simply uncovering remains. They were restoring dignity to lives nearly erased by war and silence. The forest surrounding the site became hallowed ground. Researchers and villagers alike moved carefully, acknowledging that this place had witnessed unimaginable loss. Paths were marked, the excavation preserved, and a memorial erected to honor those who had vanished and now returned, even if only in fragments of memory and soil. Psychologists and historians observed the profound impact on families. Decades of unresolved grief were suddenly confronted. Children who had grown into adulthood carrying absence now had names, faces, and histories to anchor their mourning. Long-held silences gave way to stories, retold with care, reverence, and emotion. Yet, the human mind struggled with the enormity of revelation. For decades, people had accepted absence. They had constructed lives around the void left by missing fathers, brothers, and sons. Now, reality intruded, and it was unbearable in its intensity. Relief, sorrow, gratitude, and anger collided. Families embraced, cried, and remembered. Communities debated what to do with the site. Should it be left untouched? Preserved in its raw, tragic form? Should artifacts be displayed publicly or kept private for families? Every decision carried the weight of 77 years of secrecy, loss, and silence. The press, though respectful, could not help but frame the story in the language of shock. Vanished train found after 77 years. Soldiers of World War II returned to memory. Secrets of the forest revealed. Yet for those who had lived with the absence, the headlines were pale shadows of the emotional reality. The true weight was in the faces of descendants, in the letters returned, in the soil pressed from uniforms and boots, in the diaries and photographs, finally breathing life once more. For some villagers, the discovery resolved decades of quiet fear. Children's ghost stories, once dismissed, were now understood as echoes of truth. Shadows in the fog, strange sounds at night, the whisper of wheels where rails no longer existed. They were not imagination. They were memory, waiting for the world to catch up. Historians began publishing detailed accounts, piecing together the train's final journey. Yet, even as answers emerged, questions remained. The fog that had swallowed the train, the unnatural preservation of the soil, the deliberate concealment of carriages. These elements hinted at forces, perhaps human, perhaps chance, that could not be fully explained. Families grappled with the paradox of closure and loss. Relief that their loved ones were identified. Grief for the lives cut short. pride that the stories had been restored, and awe at the resilience of memory, preserved in the earth and reclaimed after nearly 8 decades. And beneath it all, the forest watched, patient, silent, eternal, its secrets no longer fully hidden, but still, in some way, intact. Shadows moved in the trees. Leaves whispered in the wind. A place that had swallowed a train and its soldiers for 77 years had finally returned them. But the mystery, the fear, the weight of history, it lingered. Because some stories do not end when the earth releases them. They continue, carried in memory, in letters, in the hearts of those who finally bear witness. The vanished soldiers had returned to memory. Their lives, long interrupted, were finally acknowledged, and the world, now confronted with the full weight of their story, could begin to understand what had been lost and what had been preserved through the patient silence of decades. The forest had finally yielded its secret. The train, once swallowed by fog and soil, lay revealed. Carriages pressed together, artifacts scattered carefully among skeletons, letters and photographs returned to hands that had waited lifetimes to hold them. The soldiers, once erased by time, were remembered. Yet even in revelation, the forest whispered its eternal truth. Some mysteries are not meant to be fully explained. Some secrets, no matter how long hidden, resist closure. Families visited the site again and again. They touched the uniforms preserved in glass displays. They read letters that had been buried for nearly 8 decades. They whispered names into the wind, imagining voices answering from the soil. Tears mingled with laughter. Memories, long dormant, breathed life again. Descendants spoke of a sense of presence, of a quiet acknowledgement from the past. The forest seemed to respond, rustling leaves in cadence with emotions that had finally found their way into the light. Historians chronicled the findings with awe. They described preservation that seemed almost unnatural. Soil that acted as time's archive, metal, wood, paper, all resisting decay to tell the story of the vanished soldiers. Analysis of diaries and letters provided insight into fear, hope, despair, and courage. Yet even with these revelations, one truth remained. The full story of that morning in 1943, the fog that swallowed the train, the decisions made by unseen hands. Some of it remained beyond understanding. Communities near Gleesmer Road embraced the memory. Memorials were built. Names were etched into stone. Candles were lit each year in honor of the vanished and the now found. The forest, once a place of whispered fear, became a sanctuary of remembrance. Psychologists spoke of closure, partial, fragile, but real. Families had waited generations for confirmation that their loved ones existed, that their stories mattered. And now, they could mourn properly, honor the past, and yet carry forward, tethered not to absence but to acknowledgement. Yet, reflection is never purely solace. Some felt grief renewed. Knowing the soldiers had suffered in soil and fog for decades reignited sorrow. Seeing artifacts that had been pressed against hearts and hands, imagining the moments of fear and desperation, created a bridge across time that was both comforting and unbearable. And in that balance, the tension of grief and relief, truth resonated. The world, when confronted with a story, learned more than names, dates, and objects. It learned the weight of patience, of memory, of the earth as keeper of secrets. It learned that lives lost are not always loss of history, that absence and echo across generations, and that revelation can be both awe-inspiring and painful. The soldiers themselves, now remembered, became symbols of endurance, of memory preserved in silence, symbols of lives interrupted and yet not forgotten. Their story reached beyond the forest, beyond Gleesmer Road, beyond Germany. It traveled to descendants across continents, to historians, to communities who had never known their names, but could feel their presence. Archaeologists reflected quietly on their role. They had not merely unearthed artifacts. They had unburied souls, revealed lives, restored dignity. Every trowel of soil removed was an act of compassion. Every fragile discovery was a bridge connecting decades of absence to the present. And yet, the forest remained. Patient, silent, timeless. Its fog, its shadows, its whispers, all reminders that some mysteries are alive, even when revealed. That history is not just a record of events, but the weight of memory, the preservation of lives, and the echo of voices across generations. In the quiet moments, when the wind stirred the leaves over carriages, it was as if the soldiers spoke once more, not in fear, not in despair, but in acknowledgement of being remembered. Their journey, once lost in fog and soil, had found a conclusion in memory and revelation. The train, the soldiers, the letters, the photographs, all of it returned to the world. But history, as ever, remains a living thing. The forest had given up its secret, but it had left behind the question of human resilience, the fragility of life, and the haunting beauty of remembrance. And so, the story does not end with discovery alone. It continues in every family that now knows a father's fate, in every village that remembers a vanished, in every historian and archaeologist who bore witness to lives interrupted but not erased. Because some stories are larger than time. Some stories are preserved in earth and memory until the world is ready. Some stories, even when concluded, echo across decades, whispering lessons in silence and truth. And in Gleesmerode, where fog once swallowed a train and its soldiers, the forest watches still. The trees, the shadows, the soil, they bear witness to courage, absence, and the enduring power of memory. The vanished train had returned. The soldiers were remembered. And the world, for the first time in 77 years, could listen